it. And happy Friday, everybody. Memorial Day weekend. So I do want to say that, oh, hold on a second. Let me get his name. Um, I was asked to do a space with Coyote of Wall Street um, to talk about false flags. And I am probably going to do that sometime tomorrow evening. But I will let you guys know if we set up a time for that. So I also want to let you guys know that I was recently asked, we don't have a date set up or anything else, um, to come on. Let me get his name right. Um, David Nino Rodriguez, who is a famous boxer. He has a podcast. He's a good friend of Alpha's, to come on his show to talk about Operation Gladio. So, again, I don't have a date for that, but when I do, I will let y'all, all of y'all know. I'm definitely excited about that show. So, anyway, on to the book, chapter 5, The Splendid Blonde Beast. So, this chapter starts off in January 30th, 1933, when Hitler becomes chancellor, and less than 3 months later, his government sets out decrees restricting Jewish people from working as doctors, dentists, lawyers, teachers, and civil servants. In October, so he took office in January. So by October, a decree had been issued to bar non-Aryans or people married to non-Aryans from working as editors in the media. Nazi officials denounced Jewish culture in literature and in movies, and they had already began burning books. The Nazi Party and the SS, not the industrial and financial elite, initiated the Holocaust, but they succeeded in their program of genocide only by enlisting collaborators that were industrial and financial elites. They gave financial incentives to German business communities. They basically had instituted later the policy of taking businesses, blah, blah, blah. We know all of that. The author goes in and says, but Hitler's government did make it possible for businesses to reap rewards for persecuting Jewish people, as well as exploitation of prisoners of war and forced laborers. German finance and industry made the most of that opportunity. And this isn't isolated. Keep this in mind. This is going on in Japan while it's going on in Germany. And I would argue it was just as, maybe not numbers wise, it was just as, if not worse, in Japan. Because keep in mind, we know that the forced laborers on the Philippines, after they dug all of those gold caverns to store all of their treasure in, they literally blew them up to steal the site. Like, some of them, the ones that didn't kill everybody instantly, and there was some indications that some of them had lived through the explosion only to die because they suffocated. So there was some horrific things going on in both theaters. But it's weird how you only ever hear about the European theater. Private enterprise first fed on the German government's program to Aryanize Jewish property, that is, to force the sale of Jewish owned property at a fraction of its value to ethnic German business owners. This was called voluntary Aryanization because the Jewish people were allowed to sell it. But of course, because of so many sales at the time, they were getting pennies on the dollar for what their businesses were worth. So it wasn't really voluntary. But it was better than sticking around because a lot of the people used the money generated from the sale of their business to get out of Dodge. Later came the compulsory version of it, which began in November 1938. The government seized Jewish property without compensation and sold the plunder to other German companies. Now, what's interesting about this, and that's the reason why I make such a distinction between communism and fascism, because fascism, as we know, involves large oligarchical business. Communism does not. So understand that none of these people wanted communism. They wanted fascism. The Nazis also consolidated some formerly Jewish and Polish-owned companies useful in war production to large conglomerates run by Germans. The forced sale in 1930s usually maintained the trappings of quote-unquote ordinary commerce. There were attorneys, formal bills of sale, and this is where you're going to find Sullivan and Cromwell too, because they were international lawyers making a whole bunch of these deals. The voluntary Aryanization provided strong incentives for tens of thousands of Germans to profit from this supposedly minor form of persecution. It built support for Nazi rule because, remember, in all of these countries, you have to build this elite, and in the case of Germany, it largely existed, that is going to be loyal to the government. Nazi rule ensured the legitimacy of their new acquisitions. Most of these expropriations continue to be recognized by German courts to this day. The earliest Aryanization can be traced to a national boycott of Jewish businesses initiated by the Nazi Party shortly after Hitler came to power. The local leaders persecuted Jewish people during this boycott as a show of power, according to Anne Block, a historian. For Aryan businessmen, the boycott was a convenient means of getting rid of their competition. It also provided an opportunity to buy their competition for pennies on the dollar. It also served to fulfill the material promises that the Nazi Party had made to them, many of which.
Ma'am,
What?
if I can interrupt for just a quick second, you don't have video over on Rumble.
Okay.
It may be unavoidable, but
No,
I wanted to let you know.
Yeah, I think I got it. There's this switch or toggle thing where you select one and then it goes back to the other sometimes, which I figured out the last time we lost video. Thank you. Okay. The Dresdner Bank caught wind of, okay, hold on. I lost my place. Large-scale theft through Aryanization soon became a fact of German life. Early in Hitler's rule, for example, Dr. Ignaz Nacher, Nacher, a prosperous Berlin Jewish man decided to sell Germany's second largest brewery to Engelhart Brewery AG. Following repeated harassment and a Nazi organized boycott of his beer. This was well before Hitler had consolidated his power. Nacher hoped to flee the country with his fortune intact. The sale was to be finalized in May 1934. But the Dresdner Bank caught wind of this arrangement. According to an affidavit filed in a Munich court, the Dresdner Bank, due to the fact that they had an interest in acquiring that same business, had seen to it that Nacher was arrested under a false pretense. He was put under such pressure that he had to give his lawyer unlimited power of attorney for the disposal of all of his possessions. He was informed that he would not be set free if he didn't sign the power of attorney. The attorney then sold the brewery to Dresdner Bank for a fraction of its value. And Dresdner sold the largest interest in the business to one of the bank's own directors, Karl Rachsche, Rasche, who installed himself as the chairman of the brewery's management board. Nacher's partner sued Dresdner for breach of contract and damages, and for a time the dispute worked its way through the Munich courts. Then the Gestapo summoned the partners to Berlin and threatened to arrest them unless they dropped the case. Under Karl Rachsche, the brewery became a center of Nazi power and patronage. Dresdner Bank handed out positions on the brewery board of directors to half a dozen of the major industrial figures, including steel magnate Paul Pilger, Nazi strap hangers on, took over local distribution rights, and many old Nazis remembered the Engelhart brew as the drink of choice at party gatherings. Rauch was convicted at Nuremberg of crimes against humanity in connection with the organized plunder of the entire country. By then, the brewery extortion had almost been forgotten about. Legal expropriation soon became a gold rush. In June 1936, the mainstream business newspaper published a glowing article praising German economic progress since the Nazis had come to power. And basically, it was all due to this type of business practice. The entry for 1933 recorded 6 major deals, 2 of which were acquisitions financed by the Dresdner Bank on behalf of the Flick Group, F-L-I-C-K. In another contract, German shoe manufacturer Richard Freudenberg purchased his major competitor, a Jewish-owned Conrad Tacking Company. This was the first of a number of such Aryanization for Freudenberg. The U.S. government was later to report and helped build his business into the worldwide shoe and leather empire that it is today. The major paper listed 21 very large transfers and consolidations in 1934 alone. Most were forced buyouts by multi-million-dollar Jewish firms by the German competitors. In 1935, 32 such large contracts were reported, including 2 major acquisitions of Jewish firms by the Siemens Group. One by the Robert Bosch concern, and one by the Link Hoffman Work, and another by Flick. The pace accelerated in 1936 with 22 major acquisitions in the first 5 months alone, including 2 more by Flick and 1 by the German subsidiary of none other than Ford Motor Company. Ford's attempted Aryanization of Jewish property was symptomatic of the role the U.S. business played in Germany throughout the first decade of Hitler's rule. At Ford's headquarters in the U.S., executives indicated that they wished to acquire the former Stower Work AG, a bankrupt German company, and it wasn't actually bankrupt, they just wanted it, for use as auto body production plant, building Fords for sale throughout Central and Eastern Europe. Although the company declined to disclose the terms of the deal, it did acknowledge that Ford's German subsidiary had become one of the U.S. company's most important overseas units. And I just wanted to read one of the footnotes here. One of these was an acquisition by the Deutsche Bank and Siemens of Ironwork Electric AG of Berlin, a manufacturer of electric meters and radios. According to a later U.S. study, Ironwork owner Manfred Aaron had until 1935 been determined to hold on to his firm and wait out the Nazis. But after the Gestapo arrested him several times and threatened his family, Aaron decided to sell his company for a fraction of its value in the late summer. The Deutsche Bank financed the deal on behalf of Siemens Holding Company. Simon, whatever it is, group dismissed the Aaron family directors, installed their own men, and changed the company name to Heliowatt AG. Once under Siemens' control, Heliowatt became a holding company for a number of other acquisitions. Siemens companies eventually emerged as one of the largest contractors for concentration camp labor in Germany. Also, the big newspaper over there reported that Ford's purchase indicated a realization of the world's view of race as a basis of economy. Ford's German director, Heinrich Albert, wrote to headquarters in Dearborn that taking over Stower's was the best means to secure new German military contracts and to create the psychological basis to win the support of dominating circles, especially the Nationalist Socialist Party, by assisting in the expulsion of Jews from German economy. Ford's German subsidiary, whose directors included Ford's U.S. President Edsel Ford, its overseas chief Percival Perry, Berlin attorney Heinrich Albert, and German automaker Karl Bosch, adopted race as a criterion for employment in the German company. The next year, Ford dismissed its general manager, Friedrich Diesel, who had carried out many of the dismissals when it was discovered that he had a Jewish ancestor. In a revealing development, however, Ford abandoned the Stower Work acquisition when the company discovered it would cost too much to introduce new technology in mass production. Thus, Ford was willing to participate in the Nazi Aryanization only if it was profitable. Other U.S. banks, companies, investors participated and profited from this. In the early 1930s, Germany imposed tight currency restrictions on foreign companies, forcing U.S. corporations to choose between investing their profits from German sales exclusively in the Third Reich or abandoning the German market altogether. Virtually all U.S. companies chose to stay. This reinvestment requirement created pressure on foreign companies to find profitable new investments inside the Reich. Two areas seemed especially promising: Aryanization and the semi-clandestine German rearmament program. New German conglomerates built mainly on the seizure of Jewish-owned companies sold bonds on the international market to raise capital to buy even more companies. Bankers traded German corporate securities that were de facto Aryanization bonds, though not called that by name. They sold them in New York, London, Zurich, and other financial centers. Dillon Reed, Vice President William Draper, emerged as one of the most prosperous traders of these bonds. As director of the German Credit and Investment Corporation of New Jersey, he specialized in U.S. investments in Hitler's Germany. After the war, Draper was to become the U.S. economic chief in occupied Germany. You just can't make that shit up. The U.S. companies bought substantial interest in established German companies, which in turn plowed that new money into the arms production that had been banned under the Versailles Treaty. According to a 1936 report from Ambassador William Dodd to President Roosevelt, a half dozen key U.S. companies, and yes, we're going to name them, International Harvester, Ford, General Motors, Standard Oil of New Jersey, and DuPont, had become deeply involved in German weapons production, in part because of the problem of repatriating the profits. Our airplane people, Dodd said, have secret arrangements with the Krupps. U.S. investment in Germany accelerated rapidly after Hitler came to power, despite the Depression and Germany's default on virtually all of its government and commercial loans. Commerce Department reports show that U.S. investment in Germany increased 48.5% between 1929 and 1940, while declining sharply everywhere else in continental Europe. You know, it's almost as if they knew there was going to be another war. U.S. investment in Great Britain, while larger than that in Germany, barely held steady over that entire decade at 2%. So all of the money was going into Germany. The pace of Aryanization in Germany intensified to the point that some German bankers began contending that any failure to participate in the legalized looting of Jewish property would open them up to charges of being poor managers of depositors' funds. Dresdner's managers complained in 1935 to senior management that the rival Deutsche Bank had a $5 million mark Aryanization fund that could be exploited by lending officers without the usual review and processing of large investments. This gave Deutsche Bank a leg up. So they're competing to fund the confiscation of Jewish businesses. At least at Deutsche Bank, letters regarding Aryanization were sent by the CEO of Deutsche Bank to the individual main branches around the end of 1938, unquote. The Bank Berlin senior manager, Erhard Schmidt, told interrogators after the war, quote, they stated, first of all, that Aryanization was now quite common, and then pointed out that Dresdner Bank was deriving appreciable profits from such transactions. And for that reason, the Deutsche Bank, in its own interest, would have to take advantage of all opportunities along those lines, unquote. Aryanization was seen as a legitimate business opportunity by all. The Nazis, well, not the Jewish people, but everybody else. The Nazis played only a limited role in the Aryanization markets. The state created a legal framework for the process, but it was the private businesses that were doing this. By late 1935, economic minister Heimar Slatt, who was basically referred to as Hitler's banker, sensed the profits that the government could derive by imposing itself as a middleman in all of these deals. Under his plan, much of the capital gain would go to the German state, which would also collect a variety of taxes and transfer charges on these transactions. Schlatt's comments and actions during the month leading up to the notorious anti-Semitic Nuremberg race laws in 1935 tacitly confirmed that the German private sector had often been a driving force in the economic persecution of Jewish people. Slat was not opposed to afflicting Jews, as even his self flattering post war memoirs make clear, but he was convinced that the Nazi state should play a greater role in regulating it so they could profit from it as well. Slot agitated for faster liquidation of Jewish businesses in his speeches to manufacturing groups and financial forums. He insisted that Hitler's state should control the process and become its principal beneficiary. The Jew, here, this is a quote from him: "The Jew must realize that their influence is gone for all time," unquote. He also went on to say, quote, "We desire to keep our people and our culture pure and distinctive, but the solution of these problems must be brought about under state leadership and cannot be left to unregulated individual action, which means a disturbing influence on the national economy," unquote. Aryanization appears to have been second only to the vast economic trauma of the Depression in its contribution to increasing the concentration of wealth and economic power in the hands of a few German cartels during the 30s. According to a 1939 study by Günther Kaiser, according to Kaiser, virtually every major German company had adopted the practice. This is a quote from him. And some crazy name with about 20 letters in it. After 1936, Mannsmann, Frederick Flick, Otto Wolff, and Reichswerk German Göring gained influence in these fields. All four of the newcomers had directly benefited from the Aryanization. In the chemical industry, Jewish plants manufacturing soaps and cleaners, paints, and varnishes were taken over during the Aryanization. And basically, they were converted into a death machine intended for previous owners. The systematic expropriation of Jewish property was well advanced by the time the German government instituted compulsory Aryanization in late 1938. The new economic minister, Walther Funk, reported in November that of 7 billion marks worth of stock, bonds, real estate, and business assets registered in Germany as Jewish owned, some 2 billion had already been taken by German nationalists through Aryanization. That month, the state announced a new tax. It was an atonement payment designed to tax Jewish people for the damages of the Kristallnacht pogroms that the Nazis had themselves instigated. The collection of this new payment was reported to have been administered by none other than the Deutsche Bank. The amount stated at first was 1 billion marks, purportedly to recompense for the abominable crimes of Jewish people. But within a week, Göring increased the levy. Hitler's government collected still another 900 million marks through this flight tax. Maybe that's where California got that idea. And New York tried to do that to Rush Limbaugh, too. Maybe that's where they got the idea, which seized at least a quarter of the assets of every person who immigrated out of Germany. I'm convinced. So they were all Nazis. I'm sure that's where they got the idea. By the mid-1940s, Aryanization and punitive taxes had seized roughly 4 billion marks from German and Austrian Jewish people. This was equal to more than 75% of Germany's annual investment in armament plants and military facilities on the eve of the war. It was about equal to the total assets of the Deutsche Bank and more than 12 times that of the Nazi Germany's giant industrial holding company, VIAG. Hermann Göring, the senior official in charge of war mobilization, was later to claim that Germany's preparation for war had been bankrolled from two sources: Aryanization of Jewish property and the looting of the Austrian state treasury. Nazi leaders saw the forced liquidation of Jewish assets as essential to the viability of the Third Reich. The Aryanization were probably crucial to the Nazis' political survival as well, at least during the first decade of their rule. The collaboration of German big business, shopkeepers, and professionals that was crucial to Hitler's power in the 1930s would likely not have occurred without widespread Aryanization, because they were all profiting from it. Their competing economic interests would likely have created political divisions that the Nazis could not control. Most members of the German economic elite were not Nazi ideologues, nor fanatical anti-Semites, at least not as individuals. They were, however, willing to sacrifice all of their morals and values and innocent people in order to get rich. They compensated for their complicity in mass murder through grumbling and doubts, acts of self-interest, in that some instances ran counter to even things that Hitler wanted done. German executives, military officers, religious leaders often put forward some individual deed as proof of resistance to the Nazis. In reality, though, during Hitler's years, most of them had developed and maintained institutions essential to the system of destruction. This split between the individual and institutional behaviors became central to the elite's largely successful effort to escape culpability after the Holocaust. And that's what happened to Schmidt. They were all able to point to one little deed out of 100. So 99 of their daily actions was supportive of the Nazis. But, if they wrote a letter, they made a comment, or they passed up the opportunity to buy something, they used it as their justification of resisting Hitler when they did no such